Great. Well, please do have that passage open in front of you from Habakkuk 2. We left Habakkuk last week in the waiting room. I'll just give you a quick summary, just in case you've forgotten. We've said Habakkuk's a little bit like an ancient form of question time. So Habakkuk brought his first question at the beginning of chapter 1, really about the state of Judah and why God doesn't seem to be intervening. The people seem to have thrown God off and his ways, and Habakkuk's crying out for God to respond. God then does respond with his first answer and says, I am about to act. I am about to do something. In fact, I'm going to do something that you would never have guessed. Even if someone told you, you wouldn't believe it. He says, I'm going to raise up the Babylonians in chapter 1, verse 6. That then created all sorts of extra questions for Habakkuk. The Babylonians really were a terrible people with a terrible history of swallowing nations, treating people terribly. And Habakkuk's wondering, how can you use a people like that? How can you allow them to go from nation to nation doing their thing without dealing with them? And Israel are bad, but we're not as bad as those Babylonians. So how can this be the case? How can you use them? God then answers his second answer, which we have in chapter 2. And we're getting into that answer today. But we had the wonderful model of Habakkuk that Lou's referred to, just that model of the man, the person of faith, who rehearses what they know to be true about God, who brings their questions honestly to God, and then waits for the Lord to speak. And as we go into chapter 2 today now, and into particularly verses 6 to 20, we see God's answer to this question about the Babylonians and their future and what he's going to do about them. So in many ways, where we've left Habakkuk is we're urging him, or certainly verse, 4 of chapter 2 urges him to live. The righteous will live by faith. So live by faith while you're in the waiting room. Habakkuk is where we finished. And I suppose I just wanted to say that as we start that, we know as Christians we're called to live by faith in the waiting room as we wait for God's promises to fully and finally come. But it's much more easily said than done, isn't it, I think? It's okay to sort of say to Habakkuk, the Babylonians are coming, but don't worry, Habakkuk, in sort of 80 years or so, God's going to bring the exiles back to the land and restore them and bring his law back among them and revive the people. That day is coming, Habakkuk, and the Babylonians are going to be dealt with, Habakkuk, so that's good. And in the future, chapter 2:14, we said last week, the glory of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. That's all ahead, Habakkuk. So live by faith in the waiting room. It's actually easy to say that. But when the Babylonian war machine arrives and you begin to see the devastation, it's far harder, isn't it, to actually do than to say, to live by faith. Or when the exiles have been out of their land and away from home for 30, 40, 50 years with no end in sight, it's far easier to say, live by faith, than to actually do it. And we would want to encourage each other, and we've done that throughout the series in Hebrews, to keep on living by faith, be men and women of faith now while we wait. And it's easy to do that, isn't it, in some ways, when the waiting room is cosy, when life is okay, when we're enjoying all of God's gifts and provisions. But it's a lot harder when there's the threat of persecution, the threat of insult or being sneered at for the Christian that stands up for God and God's word. It's a lot harder then to live by faith. It's harder when our home life perhaps is difficult and challenging, or work is difficult, or we lose a job, or our bodies are ill and struggling. It's hard when we see those that seem to have no thought for God thriving and prospering. So there are times when it's a lot harder to live by faith in the waiting room. And actually, I think it's hard for all of us. We've been thinking a bit about this recently, that we do live, as I think Paul said to the church in Rome, I think it was, with the world looking to squeeze us into its mould constantly. And I think particularly in recent decades with the takeoff of the media and our lives being surrounded and infiltrated in ways that were never the case in the past, the world has its claws in us, as it were, to squeeze us into its mould, that we think the way the world thinks. We've also got our sinful nature, of course, within every one of us as Christians, who is constantly will be looking to pull us out of the waiting room. Don't live by faith. Live for now. Live for what the world lives for. And of course, the Bible says we have a spiritual enemy, the Satan who looks to oppose the work of God in every one of us. So it's easy to say live by faith in the waiting room, but actually it's a very, very difficult thing for us to do. And what we're going to see in the sort of second 2/3 of chapter 2 are 3 incentives for us to continue to live by faith in the waiting room. I'm going to leave 2 of them for next week, so there's only 1 today, and hopefully there'll be a fairly clear message that will come through. But let's just focus on incentive number 1 for living by faith in the waiting room. Whatever's going on around us, whatever the challenges are, it's the right way to live. It's the sensible way to live by faith in God and in the promises and the word of God. So incentive number 1, let me just put it very clearly at the start, and it's going to come out, I think, across very dramatically and strongly, really, in the wordings of these verses as we come up. Incentive number 1 is put negatively. The incentive to live by faith in the waiting room is because, number 1, the puffed up will perish. And Habakkuk, or God, doesn't pull any punches in this chapter. Incentive number 1 is for us to remember always that the puffed up will perish. And therefore, refusing the way of faith or leaving the way of faith never, ever, ever will profit us ultimately. That's the strong message, I think, of this second chapter. What we get in verses 6 to 20 is a detailed description of Babylon, or a detailed description of the puffed up. Remember we said last week the puffed up word? I'm going to mention it again because I love it. It's a swelling. That's what the word means, a swelling. The puffed up are self-reliant, selfish. It's all about self-centered, what they can get. They're puffed up, they're proud. So we get in these verses 6 to 20 a description of what the puffed up are like. And this describes Babylon, but it describes every single nation that rejects God as their God, and it describes every person that rejects the living God as their God. We all come under that title of being the puffed up. So we'll get a description of the puffed up in verses 6 to 20, and then very strikingly we will see the consequences of living this way, living without faith in God. Have a look at verse 6, because verse 6 tells us that the way God is giving this prophecy to Habakkuk is he's giving him a song, like a taunt song. Verse 6, will not all of them taunt him with ridicule and scorn? One of my part joys of when we were in Australia is I booked a couple of tickets to go and watch the England cricket team playing at the Sydney cricket ground against Australia. It was the 5th match in the series, the Ashes series. We'd already lost 4 of them, so we were getting absolutely smashed every match. But somehow, randomly, my tickets that I'd been assigned I ended up being in the middle of the Barmy Army. And the Barmy Army, if you don't know them, are basically a group, hundreds, if not thousands, of English cricket supporters that follow the English cricket team all the way around the world to all of the away matches. They all sit together, they have musical instruments, and they've got songs that they've written, and they sing them for hours on end, whether England are winning or not. And I was there in the middle of these. Some poor Australian fans had also got seats in this area, and one by one they were moved into other seats in the ground. They couldn't take the taunt songs. Your next queen is Camilla Parker Bowles. Camilla Parker Bowles, Camilla Parker Bowles. They sang to the Australian fans in the ground. That was followed by, there's $1 to the pound, $1 to the pound. There's $2 to the pound. There's $3, the currency, the strength, the might of England. Our queen will reign over you. Our currency's better than you. Taunt songs. I think a recent match I went to see Watford against Manchester United. For the first 20 minutes, I could only hear the Manchester United fans singing. And they sang these words, you only came to see United. Singing at the thousands of Watford, you only came to see United. And when Watford scored after 20 minutes, silence for the United fans. And then every Watford fan singing, you're not singing anymore. Taunt songs. That's what we have here, verses 6 to 20. It's a taunt song. It's a song, and think about this in terms of the chronological order of this. God is giving Habakkuk these words, this revelation. Remember verse 2, that can be written down. It speaks of the end. It will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come. God is giving Habakkuk this taunt song before the Babylonians have even arrived. And this song is taunting them about what is going to happen in the future. Yes, they will arrive in power, but this is a taunt song as to what's going to happen to them in the days to come. The taunt song basically says, once you Babylonians were in the ascendancy, but now you are defeated, you are triumphed. Though it linger, wait for it, it will certainly come and will not delay. It will certainly happen. So they're going to taunt the Babylonians now in this song, or God is. The people of Israel are going to taunt them. And it's all around 5 woes. I don't know if you noticed that as John was reading. Just glance down at the passage just to see them. So verse 6, woe to him. Verse 9, woe to him. Verse 12, woe to him. Verse 15, woe to him. Verse 19, woe to him. This is a parody of a funeral dirge. Mighty Babylon are as good as dead. Now let's just whip very quickly through these 5 woes, and I'm just going to give you a highlight sort of package of them. You could almost do a sort of a talk on each one of these. There's so much in it. Remember, we're getting a description here of the puffed up person or the puffed up nation, puffed up Babylon, and we're going to see the consequences for those that walk this route of being puffed up, refusing faith in God. So you keep your eyes on the verses, because I'm only going to mention some bits. But look at the first woe, verse 6 onwards. Just let your eyes scan down that. Once Babylon sought after wealth, verse 6, piling up stolen goods, making the nation rich and wealthy by taking from others. But when God acts, death will come. Woe to Babylon. Verse 7, the debtors will suddenly arise. The mighty will tremble. The plunderer will be plundered. I think there's some wonderful phrases actually in this chapter. That's amazing, isn't it? The plunderer will be plundered. The Babylonians will become the victims, and a right punishment for their sin will be meted out. Refusing the way of faith never pays. Or the second woe, once Babylon sought security from verse 9 onwards for herself, without God, building a realm by unjust gain. And what was the great driver in verse 9? Have a look at verse 9 there. Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. Has anybody in the building got a bird feeder of any sort in their garden? Yeah. Oh, a few. Yeah, they're great fun, aren't they? I had one thing, but the other day went out and got one of these ones with several arms hanging off of it and different foods on there. And the birds absolutely love it. They're all over it. It's great fun just watching them and so on. But I was a bit worried when I put mine into the ground, because as the further the spike went in, the lower the food came to the ground. You know, and there's somebody got one of these next door, and it's nice and high. And so we've got a cat. And there's a cat. My cat's going to star twice this morning. We've got a cat, and there's a cat next door. And I've noticed they come and they lie in the bottom of the bushes in our garden, just looking at the bird feeder. And it's a bit low. And I'm a bit worried. I've not seen any of these birds get caught yet, thankfully. But you wonder how much in the bird, as they're pecking away, they're probably thinking to themselves, I wish Chris had put this up a bit higher, because we're safer up higher. And that's the words that are there in verse 9. The idea of Babylon building their house by unjust gain. So in justice, they take from others, and they do it so that they can set their nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. It's a wonderful image. Their security is in their own hands. That's the sort of image here. They take towns and cities apart. They build their empire in order to be secure, to be away from the clutches of others. So this second woe is all about them seeking security. Look at verse 10. You have plotted the ruin of many peoples, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life. They'll happily ruin others, but they want to keep themselves secure and out of the clutches of harm. And then verse 11, the image of the house that they're building, the stones and the beams of their self-built empire cry out against them. In other words, even the thing that they're building is crying out against them, testifying against them. The whole thing is going to come crashing down. There is no security. There is no nest that the puffed up can build in their lives, build this high up nest and think we're safe, we're secure. God is going to bring them into judgment. There is no nest high enough. Refusing the way of faith never pays. Well, the third woe, verse 12, Babylon seeking to build its empire, its towns and its cities by overpowering others. But to what end? This is a lovely phrase in verse 13. Look at God speaks here. Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labour is only fuel for the fire? The nations exhaust themselves for nothing. God is speaking here through Habakkuk, looking across the whole sweep of history, and verse 13 effectively is saying to the future Israelites and to us this morning, where is Babylon now? Where is Babylon now? Where is the Roman Empire now? Where is the Nazi Party with their great dreams of world domination now? Where are they now? That's the sort of thrust of this woe, this third woe. The nations exhaust themselves for nothing in the end, if you take the long view. The fourth woe, verse 15, Babylon's wealth and temporary security and power always come, and this is always the case with the puffed up, with exploitation. Verse 15, woe to him who gives drink to his neighbours, pouring it from the wineskin till they are drunk, so that he can gaze on their naked bodies. It's a simple sort of illustration of exploitation that comes with the puffed up. Exploiting others to feed their own selfish desires. Seduction and cruelty will always be the trademarks when people become objects to serve me. This is the heart of the Babylonian machine. It's all about them. Whether a nation or an individual, it's all about what they can get, how they can benefit on the backs of others. And verse 16 is incredibly chilling, isn't it? Verse 16, God says through Habakkuk, you will be filled with shame instead of glory. Now it is your turn. Drink and let your nakedness be exposed. The cup from the Lord's right hand is coming around to you, and disgrace will cover your glory. Twice in that little section, it refers to the fact that they've enjoyed glory for a time. They've pursued these things, they've overcome people, they've exploited others, they've sort of bathed in glory on the world stage. But the cup that they have caused others to drink, they will now drink. Now it is your turn. Now you will be naked. Now you will be exposed. Now you will be full of shame. It's your turn. Refusing the way of faith never pays. And then the final woe, verse 19, mocking Babylon's idolatry. Woe to him who says to wood, come to life, or to lifeless stone, wake up. Can it give guidance? Is covered with gold and silver. There is no breath in it. One lovely thing about, which I don't know any Hebrew, I've said that before, I'm only hearing what others tell me, some lovely little Hebrew phrases. This one here says there's no breath, no, none whatsoever. That's the sort of literal version of this. These puffed up nations, they make their own gods. They use wood, the finest wood, stone, the finest metals, and they fashion their gods. And the God of heaven says there's no breath in it, no, none whatsoever. It's dead. Verse 18, of what value is an idol carved by a craftsman or an image that teaches lies? For the one who makes it trusts in his own creation. He makes idols that cannot speak. Those that refuse the living God, and we'll see this in a minute, don't not have faith. They just tend to put their faith in the gods they create. Gods that are less than human, less than them. Gods that can't speak to them and guide them and give them wisdom. Gods ultimately that they control. Refusing the way of faith never pays. 5 times, 5 woes. The taunt song. This is what the puffed up are like. This is what Babylon are like. But this is the consequence for them. Babylon is going to be judged and punished for her sin. Habakkuk's cries for justice are going to be completely met and satisfied. We see here that God judges sin, sometimes to a degree in this life as history is unfolding. Romans 1 will say that the wrath of God is being revealed against the world that's turned its back on him. Judgment happens here and now, but judgment will happen ultimately then. And every single wrongdoing, every single act against another person, against the living God, will be accounted for. Chapter 2 is very, very strong on that. Here's my cat again. Our cat's gone funny this year. I don't know how old. I think he might be about 5 or 6 years old now, but he's got this habit now that he's almost started his own mouse zoo. So he goes out into the wild and he catches the mouse and he brings it in alive in his mouth and he brings it into the living room and he'll drop it on our carpet and then he'll paw it and it'll jump and he'll chase it and play with it for ages. Like one after another coming in, and then he loses it. And it will go under a chair or it will go behind something and he can't get it. And he sits there for ages looking and then he thinks, oh, I'm going out again. And he goes outside. And one by one, mice are being brought into our house. He's like he's not, I mean, I do talk to him. I say, look, you're a cat. What will the other cats say if they hear about this? Say all sorts of things to him. But once he's gone, I can't then go to bed knowing that there's this little creature in the room. I've got more staying power than Pascal, our cat. I will wait, I will search, I will do everything I can. I will stay up until I've got that mouse somehow with something under and slid it under and taken him outside, and I just vary which neighbour's garden I take it to. But I won't rest. And it's something I think that sits slightly uncomfortably with us, and we can understand why. But what you see in Habakkuk 2 here is the God who created this universe and created human beings, who will not rest until all sin and evil is met, accounted for, dealt with. There's something in us, I think sometimes, that we would almost rather God weren't like that. But he will pursue wrongdoing. Remember Habakkuk, why aren't you doing anything? Don't you care? Why aren't you listening? You get to the end of chapter 2 and you know that here is a God who will not leave anything unpunished and undealt with. Any expression of the puffed up, the swollen, who don't need God, who will do life their way as a nation or as an individual, he will bring it all into judgment. Everything will be laid bare is the New Testament term. Everything will be laid bare before him. And of course, and this is where, as John was reading, I wish we could spend more time. If you look at each woe, you see an aspect of sin. I'd love us to see that more and more, because it's in us. The root of sin in the Babylonians is the same root of sin in us. We seek to have more. We seek wealth. We seek to have security. We seek to have personal power. We tend to use others for our own ends to get what we want. There'll be different ways that's expressed. Some of them are very subtle. Some of them we won't even see in ourselves. We create our own gods, believe it or not. Even as Christians, we have a closet full of them. Things that we look to for satisfaction, for validation, for pleasure. The Babylonian root is in all of us. And chapter 2 here says that the cup of God's wrath is coming around to every person, in the sense that everybody's sin must be dealt with. And it's there, and in that phrase, particularly of verse 16, which speaks about the cup of the Lord's right hand is coming around to you, that we see echoes in these words recorded by Mark, that when they went to a place called Gethsemane, Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took Peter, James and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed. Think Habakkuk 2, deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul," said Jesus, "is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch." Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. "Abba, Dada, Father," Jesus prayed, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will." Jesus here is picking up not only on this phrase in Habakkuk 2:16, but it's found elsewhere in the Old Testament, that the cup of the wrath of God against sin must be drunk. For God to be just, for God to be righteous, for God to be holy, the cup of his wrath must be drunk by sinful people. And Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, praying to his Dada, Father, "Oh, that this cup could be taken from me. Oh, that there was another way. That I don't need to stand and be lifted up on the cross and drink that cup on behalf of sinners. Yet not my will, but yours be done." It's an insight, isn't it? The terror of Habakkuk 2 that's coming against Babylonian sin, that same terror is awaited by us as sinners, but was awaited by Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and at Golgotha, that he should drink that cup. The New Testament, looking back on that, said that God made him who had no sin to be a sin offering for us, so that through him we might become the righteousness of God. Or for Christ died for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He drank the cup. He drank the cup. It's amazing when you think of this world and the countries and the cultures and the diversity. I think Pam, wasn't it, prayed about the wonderful diversity in the church. And it's right, isn't it? So much diversity, so many cultures, countries, different things. We're all different. It's amazing. And yet the Bible's very clear that for all that diversity, there are only two paths in life. We either put our faith and trust in the one who drank the cup of judgment for us, or we're puffed up. We either remain in Babylon and choose to drink that cup ourselves, or we trust the one who drank it for us. And the moment that we cry out to him and say, "Jesus, thank you for coming for me. Thank you for bearing my sin. Thank you for drinking the cup of God's wrath that I don't have to," we can then sing the wonderful words that some of us will know and recognise from Charles Wesley. At that moment, we can say, "No condemnation now I dread. Jesus and all in him is mine. Alive in him, my living head, and now clothed in righteousness divine." It's an incredible, incredible message. Well, I leave you with that important question this morning. Have you put your trust in Jesus Christ? Are you in the waiting room now? Your faith is in him. Your sins are forgiven. You've laid down your weapons. The swelling is going down as you make Jesus king. Is that you? Well, next week we'll see the other two incentives. They're much shorter, just a couple of lines buried in this, two other incentives. We'll look at those next week. But let's not lose sight of the fact this week that the puffed up will perish. And so keep on living by faith in your waiting room. Whatever the challenges are, it's the way to be, it's the way to go. Trust in him. You will not be disappointed. Well, let's just take half a minute just to pray personally, just reflect, speak to God about these things. Part of the ongoing work of his Spirit is to continue to sort of reduce that puffed upness of our sinful nature, and for us to let go and to begin to follow him and be shaped by him. So we might want to pray about that just for a minute before Lou comes back.